Sparkly Beans. I'm back with another reading roundup. If you are new here, hi, my name is Avery, and I love to read nonfiction. The reading roundup videos on this channel are where I group together a few books that cover or address at least a similar theme, and I tell you a little bit about each author's take and my own perspective. If you would like to hear more about that and why I do these, you can check out the first reading roundup linked in the card above, and there's a little introduction to the series. Today, you probably saw the title and may be thinking, Avery, are you turning into a conspiracy theorist? And the answer is no. However, I have read a few different books over the past, gosh, I guess a little over 6 months, that really have made me think quite a lot about sort of the trust that we place in medical providers. And I wanted to talk about this topic because I think it can kind of probably come off sounding a little bit like, you know, I don't know, are you being paranoid? But it's useful to be informed, and I think that there's a lot that we maybe assume about the healthcare system and about the knowledge that providers have, the support that providers have, that I've learned from some of these books is not necessarily true. So to give you just a little bit of background on where I'm coming from so that you kind of know what my biases might be and you know, what my background is in the subject. I've always been unhappy with the state of healthcare in the United States, which is where I live. I don't think that's a shocking viewpoint. We're not doing great when it comes to healthcare. But I remember being like 7 years old and my mom like talking to me about universal healthcare and why she was in favor of it. And I think, I've always thought of it as kind of insurers are the problem and the healthcare system as a whole is a problem. And yet, I think I tend to, as a general rule, trust the doctors that I go to. I tend to assume that they have a certain amount of training and continuing education. And I want to be clear that, I'm going to talk about these books and some of their criticisms of different parts of the healthcare system or like different specific medical professions. And this is not to blame and shame any doctors, right? Like individually. We are obviously in a time that is extremely stressful and difficult for healthcare providers. And I in no way want to minimize that. So if you are a healthcare worker, if you, are working in that profession through this pandemic, then like hats off to you, friend, and thank you. This is really, when thinking about the question of like how much trust should we place in medical providers, it's to me more about just like thinking about the system around being a medical provider and anyone who's in a system where they're not supported, where they maybe don't have all the access to education and other resources and tools to cope with a stressful profession, like that's going to be challenging. The role of the pharmaceutical industry is something that came up especially in one of the 3 books I'm going to share, tell you a little bit about. And also there's kind of the like overarching profession and the context of the profession that medical professionals are part of, right? That doesn't necessarily like point to individual responsibility there, although it can. So yeah, I just want to give that like little disclaimer here because I think it's important to recognize, especially right now, the work that our medical professionals are doing. The books that I started to read, so like I said, I had a kind of general like critical view of the healthcare system, and especially the role of insurance, and some sense from being a queer person, from being a disabled person, neurodivergent person, somebody who's had difficult to diagnose illnesses, and a lot of challenges, admittedly, with working with healthcare professionals, but also like rarely. There's certainly times when I was annoyed at a doctor, right, for not seeming to take me seriously and for dismissing pain. But at the same time, it was so often clear that it was the context that someone's working in. They have 15 minutes to see you and are expected to follow this kind of checklist in a computer. And I think of that as being part of the problem of like the larger system. And also, even though I'm somebody who's, very like spiritual and into herbal medicine and into, also like very aware of the kind of effects of colonialism on how we think about healthcare, treating plant medicine, herbal medicine as, less valid in some way than so-called Western medicine or global North medicine is BS. And, I love, I think holistic healthcare is really important, and I wish we prioritized it in this country. So all of those things kind of come together in my perspective, but nonetheless, I still would tend to go to I don't even know what the word, I was about to say traditional, but I'm like, it's literally the opposite of traditional. Tend to go to a modern, all the words I can think of are like not quite right, but I would tend to go to a doctor's office and see, not a naturopath or a particular alternative modality, but I would just go to whoever the insurer would let me go to and see them. I would tend to assume that the doctor's doing the best they can, that they're recommending a course of action that I should trust, and leave it at that. So the first book that I'm going to tell you about is called Grief on the Front Lines. Doctors, Nurses, and Healthcare Workers Speak Out on the Invisible Wounds They Carry, by Rachel Jones. I read this book back in November, and as always, I will leave down in the, I'll have links down in the description below, so if you want to see my full review of each of the books, I won't cover them in full detail here, so you can check that out in the links. But when I started reading this book, I was expecting, so this was, November 2021, and I think it came out not too much before that, in the fall. So I was expecting it to be kind of, I knew it was a COVID book, but I was expecting it to be kind of like people telling their COVID war stories and then maybe giving, dispensing wisdom to readers on how to deal with grief and what healthcare providers had been taught, because I naively assumed that if you were in a profession where you're constantly around death and grieving and loss, that of course there must be training for that. I knew very little about the medical education process or system, other than the fact that it's really long and it's really expensive and it's really hard to get in and it's really expensive to even apply. I was always kind of actually shocked when friends would be applying to medical school compared to law school, how ridiculous the process of application is. Not to say it's wrong, just it's very intense, right? But I didn't know a whole lot about what happens once you're there. And I guess I just assumed that there would be some trauma sensitivity, some grief, education and handling grief, education and managing stress, all of that. And that's not to say there isn't at some medical schools, but in reading this book, I was kind of blown away by, this was not like a people in the medical profession dispensing wisdom from their extensive training on the subject. It was, no, we didn't get any training on this in medical school or nursing school or what have you, and here we are in this pandemic without resources, and of course, there's been plenty of like news coverage in general about the challenges of being in the healthcare professions during this pandemic. So you may know some of this already, but I just didn't realize I knew that, doctors and nurses and other professionals were overworked and stressed, and that there weren't enough humans in those professions. But I still had assumed that there was a certain amount of support given. And this book just chronicled really horrific stuff, from bullying, being really common, and especially like surgeons bullying other staff, harassment, even like bullying to the point of folks committing suicide. It just, yeah. It really hit me. And then there's the lack of any sort of support for that. And again, like it's going to vary across the system. So Rachel Jones, interviewed a lot of folks and in a lot of different professions and locations, etc. And this book does highlight some positive interventions and some programs that are being added on in different settings, and certain specialties or certain roles get more training than others. But overall, it just seems that we are woefully under equipping staff, and that's really tough to realize the kinds of like, also just like toxic masculinity, toxic sort of white masculinity, especially when it comes to, I think surgeons especially was really highlighted. And so I think in reading that book, this one wasn't so much, feeling like doctors didn't know something necessarily, but like reading about the ways in which arrogance plays in, the ways in which there's this culture, right, of not a collective culture of support, an individualist kind of culture, and the ways that in medical school, the sort of competitive nature of that then encourages this kind of arrogance and this kind of just like abuse and harassment being normalized. As a patient, you can't help but think like, oh, that's great. So like, if this, and there were some examples in the book of like pretty horrific stuff in terms of errors, but also like there was one story of a surgeon that like threw, I can't remember if it was a scalpel or some other kind of instrument, but like threw something at a nurse in an operating room with the patient unconscious on the table. I'm like, oh great, never want to have surgery again. Thanks for that information. I'm sure that is rare. Well, I hope that is rare. But I think just like that context was, and particularly the context around like medical school and the way medical education is so, doesn't seem to support certain kinds of learning, makes me realize just the ways in which these professionals aren't prepared, and then the ways in which like if other colleagues might want to speak up, might want to offer a different opinion, right, that would be, it seems, discouraged there. And then when medical professionals have mental health needs of their own, right, that a lot of institutions are not supporting that, there is a culture of not seeking out support, even right now, in terms of mental health. That is not okay. that is something that needs to change. So I had this book in my mind, and then the next one I'll share is called The Pain Gap: How Sexism and Racism in Healthcare Kill Women. And that's by Anushay Hossain. And apologies if that pronunciation is incorrect. So this one is specifically looking at women, and the title is a little misleading. Like, it's called The Pain Gap. It does, there's like some just discussion of pain, but it's really a book about maternal health care mostly. It's a book about pregnancy and birthing mostly. It does cover other things around women's healthcare, especially women of color and the disparities in healthcare. But the title's a little confusing because it's really mostly about pregnancy and birthing. That said, it's an area where, as folks may know, some folks may know, like, we're really not doing great. And this is where, you know, having read that first book and kind of having this, like, questions in my mind already about what supports exist and what education is and all of that, and already having some background in public health and knowing a fair bit about just the really unfortunate culture of, like, one, just really pushing hospital birth, even when hospital births are not necessarily the best option, and tend, honestly, not to be, unless there are, of course, certain cases in which a hospital birth would be recommended, right? And again, this is not to shame anyone's individual choices, right? There are totally reasons to prefer a hospital birth to another option. But I've read a lot about sort of just things like how we push C-sections on people, how decisions are made about what medication to use, how decisions are made about interventions. There's a lot of stuff that goes on when it comes to pregnancy and birth in this country that is, like, mind-blowing, that we allow it. And also a real lack of support for other kinds of care besides doctors, nurses, and my brain's blanking on the term. I want to say nurse midwives, but, like, certain traditions of midwifery, but, like, other traditions are not supported. And then, like, doulas in general are just, you know, not a thing that's supported as much. So this book gets into a lot of that, specifically gets into some of the racial disparities. It does talk a lot about COVID and some of the specific impacts on women of color in the healthcare profession, and then also women of color who were, like, birthing during COVID and some of the challenges there. Like, one example that I hadn't really thought of in this way that makes a lot of sense is the disproportionate impact on Black women who were giving birth at the time. Well, I guess it may still be true, but who were/are giving birth at when there are restrictive policies about who you can have in the room with you or in the hospital at all with you. Because if you're forced to choose, or can't have anyone, if you either can't have anyone or you're forced to choose between a partner and a doula, Hossain in this book goes into how that disproportionately affects particularly Black women who historically, and you know, Black birthing parents who historically have needed and have used doulas to have support and have an advocate present because of the tremendous racism that is present in how Black folks who are birthing, you know, how their needs are ignored, how their pain is downplayed, et cetera, basically not respected, self-determination not really cared about. And so, you know, doulas are one way to mitigate that. And therefore, like if you're only, if you're sort of counting on having an advocate there who knows the system, who knows if the professionals are doing something they shouldn't be, or giving advice they shouldn't be, or not listening to you, having somebody who has been through birth, who is confident to speak up and to advocate for you, like losing that option or having to choose between that and your partner has a really huge impact. This book also does go into the ways in which, in general, doctors tend to dismiss women's pain, especially, and I would say women, non-binary, queer folks as well, tend to not only do they dismiss pain, but, and this is kind of comes back to like thinking about trust and thinking about trust in providers, is that we sort of assume a certain amount of knowledge. And the fact is that a lot of medical stuff, for the longest time, women just weren't included in clinical trials for even things that are like uniquely affect women, or disproportionately affect women, or affect women differently. We didn't necessarily know that, because if the medical trial is all men or almost all men, and there's been some, certainly pushes to change that and efforts to change that, but still it's a problem. And so again, it's like, it's not necessarily the fault of like an individual doctor, but if your medical education does, and the studies that you have access to, and the information we have about certain drugs or certain treatments or certain procedures haven't been tested on any women, then yeah, that's not great. So I was just like, I was thinking about that and the ways in which pain does get dismissed, the ways in which sort of symptoms can be seen as, oh, you just have anxiety, or you're exaggerating, or you're hypochondriac. And so this book has, a fair amount of data to back that up and to show how that happens. And then the third book, and this one maybe is the most sort of like, whoa, I don't want to say the most, but just like, it's a fascinating book. It is pretty long, and I think probably could have been edited down a little bit more, but it's called The Mind and the Moon, My Brother's Story, The Science of Our Brains, and the Search for Our Psyches, and it's by Daniel Bergner. And so Bergner is a journalist, and as the title implies, his brother is involved in the story. So he basically, this is like a pretty scathing takedown of Big Pharma, which Big Pharma is no one's friend, right? But, and this is something, like, I think a lot of folks are aware that pharmaceutical companies kind of push drugs on doctors, and that doctors may be encouraged to prescribe certain drugs by the pharmaceutical industry. But this book in particular goes into psychiatric and, into drugs that are used to treat bipolar, antidepressants, antipsychotics. I'm trying to think what else. I think those are the main categories. But goes into drugs as well as treatment of psychiatric conditions like institutionalization. And it's a journalistic account. Bergner's a journalist, but it blends together research and some interviews that he did with people, in like researchers, neuroscientists, people who are working in this field, research around the history, and then there are these three main stories that are woven throughout. And again, check my review check the link below for the full review. But what kind of pertains to this? So there are three different folks, including the author's brother, that their stories are told, and it was really striking to me as somebody who's been prescribed antidepressants, for example, to learn about the ways in which sort of the history of the psychiatric profession, and then the history of specific drugs being approved, and then why they're still approved, and the interaction between general practitioners and psychiatric practitioners, was just like, oh, like we're making all this up. And you may have heard, and I kind of knew this, that like the sort of a truism, right? Nobody really knows how our brain works. Like nobody really knows why the drug is at work too, and that is true. But I did not know that there's a fair amount of study, at least according to this author. There's a fair amount of research showing that a lot of these drugs like don't perform better than placebo, particularly with antidepressants. Don't perform better than placebo, except in folks with really severe depression. They do. But that was interesting to learn. Learning about side effects and the ways that side effects had been sort of minimized, and then withdrawal. And there's one particular story of a man who, really like heartbreaking story, of a man who went through really difficult withdrawal for drugs that he may not have needed in the first place. And that just made me think about like the ways that we trust. I mean, again, there's like truisms about overprescribing, right? But if you are going through difficult time and you're having issues in your with your mental health, and you're thinking, I might have anxiety, I might have depression, and you go to the doctor and talk to them about it, at least in my experience, it's they're very quick to prescribe you with antidepressants. They don't ask a lot of questions, and a sort of realizing learning about how that is based in structural problems is what really led me to go, oh wow, I don't know that I'm gonna listen to a doctor's advice, at least like a single doctor, especially a general practitioner. I don't know that I'm gonna like immediately listen to advice on stuff like this without getting second opinions and learning more about things myself. And you may already do that, but it was definitely enlightening. Bergner looks into the history of the psychiatric profession and sort of how there was this need to distinguish as more and more people were being trained as psychologists, and as more and more the people providing mental health counseling were not psychiatrists. It was like psychiatrists that then needed to kind of establish themselves as a field, and why psychiatry specifically was needed. And that was around the time the DSM came out, the first version of the DSM. Or wait, maybe it was the DSM-3. Now I'm forgetting the details, but basically I think it was actually the DSM-3 was the one that had the kind of like checklist and everything. But Bergner talks about the way that some of these mental health disorders, and this really interested me as a neurodivergent person, that some of these mental health things and cognitive disorders were categorized and classified and described in a way that looks really rigorous and scientific. And it's like, here is a checklist of things. And it has this certainty imbued in it that doesn't come from research. Like a lot of this isn't just objectively is not coming out of research, or at least is not, there hasn't been a causal link shown, right? This was a motivated effort to lend credibility to a profession. And of course, this is one journalist's take, and it's not to say, I'm curious to hear critiques of it, but it seemed pretty convincing to me. And he kind of talks about as well, like some of the other possibilities that have been explored, and the ways in which there is motivation, profit motivation, to continue prescribing these kinds of like drugs that you have to take regularly, that you have to keep paying for, or your insurer does. There's not a lot of motivation to study alternatives, and he talks about some like promising alternatives that haven't been able to get research funding, because if SSRIs were no longer this cash cow, what would pharma do? So again, I don't know how many people already like know all this, but for me it was pretty shocking. And then, you know, he also goes a lot into some of the really awful stuff around like antipsychotics and the ways in which people are treated, tend to be institutionalized, treated in institutions, and then not listened to, not believed. The way treatment protocols are not really there to support the patients. All of that I kind of had a good sense of from being in, you know, disability justice spaces and knowing about some of the major issues with psychiatric commitment, being in a psychiatric institution or facility. But so that was not new to me. But the added layer of kind of the way the psychiatric profession and big pharma and even some of these like patient coalitions or family coalitions all kind of operate with each other just made me go, huh. So those are the 3 books that I read. Those are sort of summaries of each. I would say, again, like the reviews are below, and especially with that last one, like there's a lot that I didn't actually talk about there. It's a really fascinating tale, and I'm sort of surprised it had, like, maybe it has, but I haven't seen, like, it seems like the kind of thing that would be shocking, where just the numbers of people who are on antidepressants, and like to realize, yeah, we have no actual, like, again, evidence that it works in people who do not have very severe depression, because there is evidence there. And I, you know, I have members of my family that SSRIs have very much helped with severe depression. But as somebody who has been prescribed them in cases where I don't even know that I would qualify, now that I know more about than I did when I was younger about anxiety and depression, you know, have been prescribed medicines at times where it was just like, oh, here, have some pills, kid. It just is a little awful. And, you know, knowing the kinds of side effects that these things do have, it raises a lot of questions. And then it raises questions in, I think, a disability justice context, just because, again, it's like realizing that some of these distinctions, and I've always kind of felt like that this, like what, when we kind of put a bright line and say, like, this is autism spectrum, this is ADHD, and this is, you know, like, here are the boxes, and we know as human beings that some of these things kind of overlap, and you know, that experiences vary a lot, and deciding that one brain is normal and then one brain is abnormal has a lot to do, I think, with capitalist expectations that there is a normal and that there are those who fall outside of it, and that we should all strive to be normal, basically. And Bergner talks some about this just in the context of his own family and the ways in which family members are kind of encouraged to view a family member's experience and think of it as something to be fixed, and think of drugs and institutions and etc. as fixing this problem, rather than A, valuing neurodiversity, and then B, looking into sort of the context, the social environmental context around a person. And he gets into, in a pretty vulnerable way, I think it's his own family, you know, gets into the ways in which his brother's diagnosis gave his parents kind of an out to say, well, gave him an opportunity to see it as, oh, here's this problem that we fix with pills, or we fix with sending you to some sort of care, rather than let's look at you know, the way in which we treat our kid and the ways in which we have supported or not supported our kid, and how do we grapple with that. That kind of the cultural norm can give families an out in that way. So yeah, it's not the cheeriest reading roundup, I'm afraid, but so the somewhat inflammatory title of whether you should trust your doctor. What is my conclusion? Well, I'm not gonna know that with 3 books, but I will say that it certainly has got me thinking about the ways in which all of these factors play in, has got me thinking about the assumptions that we can kind of make sometimes, for example, having a doctor say, oh, you're experiencing depression and it's a chemical imbalance in your brain, and if you're on these drugs for a while, like, they will fix the chemical. We don't know any of that. That hasn't been proven. That there is a correlation between the drug and an improvement, but again, it's not better than placebo, and we don't know the mechanism. So this like chemical imbalance theory that probably you've heard, that a lot of people have heard, that it's like, oh, your brain just has a chemical imbalance and this is why the SSRIs work. Like, we don't actually know what mechanism it is, and why they do work when people with more severe depression and don't in others. And the brain is a mysterious thing, and so, like, I think when I hear doctors speak with confidence now, it's not that I'm going to run around assuming everything they know is false. Obviously, I have way more education than I do, reading a few books. But it's making me think about the context in which that education is received, and some of the cultural biases and factors that play into decisions and the way things are explained, and sort of wanting to educate myself as much as possible, and get second opinions where it makes sense, and to self-advocate, which I think, if there's any takeaway, I think it's that, that if you're experiencing something and a medical professional is dismissive of you, that doesn't mean that you're making it up. That doesn't mean that you're wrong. It means you, if it's available to you, then getting a second opinion, looking for support, looking for folks who can help you advocate for your needs. And that's going to be, unfortunately, easier if you're white, easier if you're male, etc. So, yeah, that was our reading roundup. You can find the links below to the reviews. And if you are interested in these and you're not already subscribed, go ahead and subscribe. There is a playlist that has all the reading roundups, and I will always have reading roundup in the title. So if that's all you're here for, you can see those right away. And you can find out all about me below if you want to follow my newsletter, check out my blog, etc., etc. All the links are there.